Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kavi Kavusi, and I'll be discussing a diverse array of subjects that span from my experiences in the emergency room to the furthest reaches of the universe. I'll be hosting guests, inviting illuminating conversations that at times may challenge ways of thinking or being, while also nurturing curiosity, meaning, and awe into life. Please consider subscribing, liking, saving, or sharing this podcast with any of your friends or family if it feels right for you. Thank you for taking the time. Let's dive into the podcast. All right. This is the next podcast that's going to be recorded with... It's tough to introduce this man with simple words because it always is beyond them. And I've come to know him over the past 4 years in a very unique setting initially, and have been able to witness him while I was at a distance in my own temple, in a place where he seemed to find, from what at least I perceived, was his temple, where he was in support of individuals while he was in support of himself. And what I found so beautiful prior to seeing this man is the content of depth that seems to emerge from his psyche relentlessly has so much brutal honesty in it. And whether you understand the language or not, you feel it. His name is Erick Godsey. And I'm very honored to be with him on this podcast. And he has his own podcast called The Myths That Make Us. Yep. Erick, I know we did an introduction a little before, but thank you for being on the podcast, man.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for having me on. In the 4 years that we've known each other, I've really enjoyed the penetrating questions that you would ask. There's a lot of people who don't ask questions and are eager just to share what they already know. But the people who ask good questions stand out, and you've always stood out. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you, man. That invitation of going into places through inquiry to places that we don't know, it makes sense why we don't. So much of a lot of these lines that we share with one another says human beings fear the unknown. No, we don't. We fear losing the known. And so not only just in the places, the environments, the people, but it's places within our mind, within ourselves, the identity. We almost put like this anchor here and say, I'm going to stay close to here. But the simple act of inquiry, either with someone else or with yourself, invites such a depth of curiosity that you find this expanse, recognizing that we're not just this little human in a place. We are a human in a playground of vastness and possibilities. Are there any inquiries that you're circling around within yourself right now that you have not found answers to?
Oh my God, yeah. Favorite inquiry that I haven't found an answer to is, what is the psyche? And that's something that I'll explore the rest of my life, and it's fascinating. My background is I have a degree in cognitive psychology, and then I got into evolutionary and behavioral psychology, but then I found Jungian psychology. And once I found Jungian psychology, that's when I started finding questions rather than textbooks of answers. And so that's one that's been my lifelong question. Recently, though, I had a friend who died, and it was the first time that I had someone that was really close to me pass. And I honestly have a little bit of shame around even admitting that I was able to make it to 31 years old before I really got to taste death. And for as much as I'm curious about non-ordinary states of consciousness and things that Jungian psychology opens up, I'm still at heart, I struggle between a pretty adamant skeptic, almost to the point of ideology, and then this other more magical part that has experienced miracles and synchronicities and things that science can't explain. But when my friend died, it really brought up in like the rage of my skeptic. And I wrote a pretty honest and at times brutal email on death for my newsletter about a month ago. And the way the universe works is, after writing that, I found myself reading a book called Life Before Life which is a book about the scientific study of reincarnation. And for people who don't know, the University of Virginia has been doing about 50 years of very good scientific research on cases of children reporting that they can remember the lives that they had before this life. And I read about 60 pages of that book on an airplane. And by the time that I landed, I realized, holy shit, I wouldn't say that I believe in reincarnation now, but the way that I described it to myself, because I journal often to try to make sense of what's going on inside of me. And the image that came up is, it's like my worldview is like Troy. And what I realized after reading that book is there was now a Trojan horse inside of my Troy. And the warriors hadn't come out yet, and they have yet to demolish my city, which would be to like change my worldview. But I can feel that after having read like the first 60 pages of that book, that the horse is inside the city. Because basically what I've concluded after reading, and I'm going to continue to read it to really get a sense of what's going on, but to ignore this evidence that has been accumulated over 50 years, that in my pretty adamant, like, skeptic stance has been conducted very well. For me to dismiss it outright would feel ideologically ignorant. And so now I can feel that for the first time in my life, I'm truly open to reincarnation being a possibility. And I can feel that I haven't integrated that at all, and that to integrate that would potentially transform how I think about most things. And so that's the current most pressing, like, what is going on here? Just to give one example, there was a little girl, she was like 4 or 5 when she would start to tell her parents that she could remember her past life. Once she got investigated by the researchers, she was asked the names of 26 people that she knew in that past life. And also, so one, she was asked to accurately name them, but then she was also asked to describe what relationship that person had to the life that she reported she had lived. So was this a mother or a daughter or a brother or a friend or a coworker? She accurately described the relationship 26 out of 26, and she accurately named the people 25 out of 26. And that's just one case out of 3,200 that they currently have.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to do with that, but I know that the horse is in my city.
It's one of those things that, especially if imagine you're that researcher who's in the presence of this woman, this girl, as she's sharing that. You're having a human sharing something that is so far away from where your constructs can make sense to any form of validity. But what you have in front of you is something that is inexplicable yet undeniable. And in those moments, there's so many moments of that and opportunities that are present in humanity for it. And I don't know if this is the same story or it's someone similar, but when I was in in residency, I was with my previous partner driving on a bridge with this other woman. And this woman proceeded to share a story with me that her 4-year-old daughter was on that same bridge a few months earlier. It was in the middle of winter. And they stopped on the road because there was an accident. And the little girl says to the mom, she's like, "Mommy, I've been here before." And she's like, "That's where I went off the side of the bridge." And then she's, "What are you talking about?" And she's like, "I died there." And she just said it with such a pleasantry on her face. And her mom went white. I am from this oversaturated light. And so the mom went and looked up, and sure enough, there had been a girl that had died there a few years prior. And she had reincarnated, but not in the genes of, it was in through another family member, but she had reincarnated and known all of the story. This girl was not someone who read the news. It just came up spontaneously. And interestingly, when she asked her again, she didn't have any recollection of the actual thing. So it was, yes, again, inexplicable yet undeniable. But so much so that when we were on the bridge, the story is so much, it feels like it touches fantasy and wonder simultaneously, because you feel all of the feelings as if you were there to witness the story firsthand.
That's the power of story too. Yeah.
Yeah. What does reincarnation mean for you if it is true? And what does it mean for you if it isn't?
God, that's a good question. Okay. One of the things that it would mean if it's not true is a very high likelihood that my skeptic belief that when I die, my experience will be like what I remember my experience was like before I was born, which is no experience. And I've done enough internal work to recognize that the root of my skepticism is actually in response to a trauma that I experienced when I was 7 or 6. And the trauma was I went to church, and whoever was the lead of the church explained to me what heaven was and said that if I was good and if I did everything right, the thing that's waiting for me after I die is there's this place called heaven where everyone who is there is happy and everything is taken care of, and you'll get to be with everyone that you've ever loved forever. And the way that he shared that with me was as if it was like the best possible thing that could happen. And that night when I went to bed, I started to think about, I almost couldn't help it, but my brain tried to grasp what forever meant. And I like saw a movie in my mind of like me waking up as the child that I am. My parents are happy, which was something that wasn't normal. And that everyone that we saw was happy and in love. And we just would do the same day again and again. And I didn't have the words for it back then, but like an existential dread, and also this felt sense of an existential betrayal. And again, I didn't have the words for it back when I was a kid, but in hindsight, what I remember feeling was almost like this deity put me inside of a experience without asking my permission in such a way that I can never leave. And that it felt terrible. And I would start to cry. And then I would eventually pray to that God to help me forget forever so that I could sleep. And it happened every night for about 6 or 7 days. And then it eventually receded back. And I can feel that a big part of my skepticism is actually to protect me from the possibility of eternity. And my personal experience with plant medicines has essentially been, can you get to a point where you can accept at least the possibility of forever? And I've done a lot of work around that. And when I'm in those spaces and I have to confront it as a experiential gnosis, I'm able to not spiral into a terrible thought loop. I can just accept it. And then when I do accept it, things open up and I get more downloads or more insights, etc. So on some level, it's my deepest fear, that forever forevers. And so one of the reasons why I can tell that unpacking reincarnation would probably restructure my Troy, if you will, is it would open up the possibility of eternity, but it would also open up a responsibility for my conduct in a way that would be new. And just an interesting side note, at Burning Man, the first time that I've ever gone was this past year. It was an incredible experience. And there was one of the nights where we were out and we were at like some musician was performing and a bunch of people were there and they had signs to help people find their group. And there was a sign of an ampersand, which is the symbol, which is like the fancy symbol for and one of my friends pointed that sign out and just made fun of like how goofy that is just to have as a sign. And the moment I looked at it and I was being helped with some LSD, for full honesty, I had this instant insight. And it's that my hellish interpretation of eternity is the closed loop symbol for always. So it's the number 8, but on its side, and that's the infinity loop. And what that symbol implies is that it's the same thing over and over. That, to the deepest part of me that makes me a human, that somehow feels like a violation. That somehow feels like an egregious if so, then terrible type of conclusion. But an ampersand is the infinity loop, but it opens. So if you took an ampersand and you rotated it 45 degrees, it's the infinity loop, but it's opened. And I had this instant download of eternity is and. It's not the same thing. It's that there is a possibility of eternity that's always becoming something new. It's the essence of evolution. And that view of eternity is healing to me in a way that felt profound. And I might get it tattooed on my body at some point because it feels important.
As you shared that, took me 3 places. First was to The Maps of Meaning by Jordan Peterson. And it, with very dense book for anyone who's curious to read on myths, beliefs, things that differentiate the world of objects and the world of action. What that even means is another.
It only took 800 pages to try to explain what that means.
But so much so that to the point that when you're looking at an infinity symbol, you're not recognizing it just as infinity and just as and continuing on. No, there's a depth of thematic association and symbolism that is so deeply intertwined, already available within you, that in that moment, maybe it was the molecules that supported, pulled some of the spaces away for it to be seen fresh and new. And the thematic symbolism came into confrontation with one another in a beautiful way. And what's interesting is where your and prolongs and invites a softness and grace into the thought and possibility of immortality, or forever, however you want to say it. I see, interestingly, with most human beings, especially in the ER, where if they had a choice or not in this moment where death is pulling them, the gravity is pulling towards the other side of the human life experience, you see them fearing that so profoundly. I don't feel that if that were true, I don't feel that a human being's constructs would be so terrified of going the other way, unless that was like a conditional invitation that a lot of the religious houses bring forth, this story of immortality, because the person in that moment would be a lot more at peace when they're passing. Some of them, interestingly, they'll have their family members standing around who remind them that they say, oh, you're going to heaven. And then you see the person soften back in. But heaven was arguably within themselves the whole time. It's just there was this story that came forth probably at a young age, much like you had experienced, that told them some level of conditionality to this story of mortality and immortality. And who lives on time anyway? It's adults. Children live timelessly. During our human life experience, one of the few animals that live as sentient beings with a functioning nervous system and heart come to know this thing called time.
Yeah.
What a privilege. And also what an interesting way that we offer the story of time to one another. But when you're in particular experiences, the story of time dissolves into either infinite time or the stopping of time, and it feels like forever.
Yeah.
And it can be terrifying or liberating.
There's a really interesting thread about time that I've been exploring in just the last few days. And so there's an interesting difference between time and timing. For people who have experienced synchronicities, the essence, the heart of a synchronicity is actually timing. It's the timing of the internal experience with an external experience that elicits a sense of meaning that feels like it transcends chance. There's actually a cognitive psychology argument that our ability to even process time grew out of the evolutionary demand for timing. In order to hunt, in order to eat, in order to avoid predators, in order to mate, we had to be able to have a coherent sense of timing between our will and then what our body would do. And then as that evolutionary need grew and grew, we got to this point where we now have what's abstract time. Now, what's interesting is our tables for time, some of them are in coherence with the movement of nature. Like the length of a year is in accord with the movement of the sun. But what's really interesting is there are aspects of our current time that are not in coherence with nature. One example is there are actually 13 lunar months in a year. But for some reason, our Gregorian calendar has 12 months. What's also really interesting is that the root word for November is 7. The root word for October is 8. The root word, or no, I'm sorry, 7.
Yeah.
October is 8. November is 9. And December is 10. Yet those are our 8th, 9th, or our 9th, 10th, and 11th and 12th month. All 4 of those months are shifted 2 months forward. And I haven't looked more deeply into this idea, and the way it was presented had a conspiratorial vibe to it. And I actually don't resonate much with it's a larger conversation, but I don't know if it was on purpose. But the idea was basically, if you were trying to create a culture that you would be able to control, you would shift it out of being in resonance with the timing of nature. And that the Gregorian calendar has this weird effect where it seems to have evidence that it's slightly askew with the rhythms of nature would be. A couple more things here that I think are really interesting. The way the modern mind divides the year is quarters. And the energy of quarters is that every quarter has to produce more than the previous quarter. The rhythms of nature is that there's seasons. There's spring, there's summer, there's fall, there's winter. There is a period of the year that's meant to recover and to go slow. And there's periods of the year that are meant to produce. We have a calendar that's all summer. And then the metaphor we use for people who stay in that all summer mentality for too long is burn out. It's too much heat. And one of the most constant pieces of advice I both have to give myself and I give people that I work with who struggle with what I would call workaholism, because I absolutely have that. It's something that I'm still struggling to reprogram, that my sense of worth for even being alive is that I have to create an output that is so much higher than everyone around me. And there's some deep stories there that we could get into. But I think a big part of why we're sick, I think there's a lot of really interesting reasons, but any culture whose time is all summer, you're going to deplete the soil, you're going to ruin the crops, and you're going to kill the animals.
There's so many angles to take that, a few that really stand out to me is the one that stands out first is the concept first of synchronicities that I want to come back to, because to differentiate between coincidence and synchronicity, I recognize coincidences as the human being in a current state of scanning the world. We scan to see if we can survive. We scan to see what's for me. And most importantly, you experience the world based on how you experience most of your higher mind stimulatory experiences, like the phone. So if you're on your phone for a long period of time, you come to scan the world rather than... Sorry?
Yeah, no, I'm just agreeing with you. I know where you're going, and I agree.
Yeah, so when you scan the world, you're looking for what serves me, what doesn't. You open tabs within the mind, whereas someone who reads, for example, has to stay with the page, formulate the image that's being invited through with this thematic association at the speed of how they can read it, in association with the letters that are available in the spacing, how the author provided it. But if you were to be a pure reader, I think your higher likelihood of having connection to world would be a lot more profound and abundant and regular. But now, as we scan, and if a human being is in some sense of fight or flight or freeze or fawn, whatever it is that has their nervous system amped up, they scan the world. And when you scan the world, you're scanning it based on timing, for survivability again, for how you can come to know things and what things you don't know, how you can know it better so you can survive it. And what that makes you unavailable to is the magic that's available in literally every moment. And so a human being will have a tendency to skew towards coincidental happenings, not seeing the association. But as there are particular experiences that I find human beings and even myself come into, is as those scanning parts soften, you're almost invited back into the tapestry of interconnectedness that happens in the world. And you start seeing associations that happen and feeling them and trusting them. And there's a shift that happens to synchronicity where once we may have said that that was a coincidence. And so I feel like that is one of the points of reclamation that we have that invites us back to the nature of time that exists in alignment with us rather than us living by time in the way that humans share with one another.
100%. And I think a really good example of a differentiation between coincidence and synchronicity is if you're on your phone for 6 hours a day, you happen to see quote unquote angel numbers that you resonate with, and you take a screenshot of it. I would say most of those experiences are coincidence. If you're looking for a synchronicity, almost as like a Zen koan, you'll not ever find one. Almost like the nature of a synchronicity is that the coincidence with your internal state and the external state is so meaningful that to call it a coincidence in the privacy of your own heart feels like you're gaslighting yourself. But what's really interesting here is there is a whole field of psychology and statistics and even economics that makes the assertion that all of it is coincidence. And they give very strong arguments for there is no such thing as a synchronicity, and that the universe is chance, and that the arising of anything meaningful is chance. And for me personally, when I was really starting to contend with my skeptical worldview when I was in my early 20s, I had gotten into psychedelics because as someone interested in psychology, my personal opinion is that if you're interested in understanding the nature of the mind and you don't explore psychedelics, the brash way to say it is you're either a coward or you're ignorant. And what I mean by that is the scientific evidence that we have that most of these psychedelic substances are incredibly safe when done responsibly. And not only are they incredibly safe, but the healing effect that they have when compared to almost every modality that we currently have for any mental disorder is orders of magnitude more powerful. And that to not agree with that is just simply not to have read the research that has happened in the last 10 years, at least with the part that it's safe and that it's effective. But if you're personally interested in understanding the psyche and you don't do something with these things to explore it, I think it's cowardly. But so with that said, I started exploring psychedelics in my early 20s, and I had done it in a way that wasn't really responsible, and I don't recommend it to other people, but I had done many journeys and I was still a skeptic. And then one day when I was about 21, I did this weird thing where I would walk for a couple of hours and I would read a book while I walked. And I'm sure I was like, I would walk the same route in my residential area, and I knew that I was the weird kid because I would walk the same time for hours, but I'd be reading a book. And one day, and this is in the summer in the middle of Texas.
And what are you reading back then?
The book I was reading was a biography about a psychologist named Erick Godsey, who created a type of psychology called transactional psychology, which was actually a precursor to internal family systems. And it's really interesting. He wrote a book in the 60s called The Games People Play, and it was a bestseller, and it was very good. But I was reading a biography about him, and I got to this chapter where the opening chapter was a quote by him, and it was something along the lines of, "The way to walk the earth like a prince is to cast golden apples for others to eat, and for you to eat your own golden apple on your deathbed." And I was like, cool quote. Once I read that quote, I went to turn down one of these streets. And so I looked up, and in the middle of the road, and there was no one out who had just gone to the grocery store, and there were no apple trees. In the middle of the road, there was a golden apple. It was one of those apples that like have red and gold, and the part that was facing me was all gold. And I was completely sober, and it rocked me in a way that was more total than any of the DMT or the LSD or the mushrooms that I'd done in my life. And I just knew in that moment that it shattered my armor. And I was like, I do not understand how the world works. My scientific worldview is partial and useful, but not exhaustive and will never be complete. And there is something else that seems to be alive. And that was the beginning of a journey where it's so interesting how stubborn my skeptic is, because I think it's trying to protect me from some terrifying feelings that are hard to feel. But the amount of miracles and synchronicities and magic that I've observed firsthand is immense. But there's also this, like, Terence McKenna has a quote, and it's something like, no one's understanding is trumps your own. You can't have anyone else's understanding. All you can have is your own. And everyone's going to have their opinions and their stories. But there's this aliveness inside of us that I think that we've learned to cut down with shame and guilt and fear, that we also try to cut down with our current scientific model. There's this thing in us that almost demands a confession of magic, confession of something more. And what's interesting is, like, our language shapes how we see the world so deeply, and we don't even have words, because it's called supernatural, which implies that it's beyond nature. And I think that's one of the many little linguistic stones that we have on the, like, plants that are trying to grow and really expand out into the light.
At the start of what you were sharing regarding the psychedelics, I'm glad that they're having the renaissance right now, to have people who otherwise were brought up to think that this was an absolute non-possibility for others to experience, let alone themselves. Now they could experience it, and especially having the invitation of what could possibly be felt, experienced, and made available by having that in their own life experience. And I had a tear in my eye because of, I don't know, it doesn't capture here. I had a dry tear because my nervous system's recalibrating after night shifts. But I saw so many patients in a moment who hurt and have little avenues to come out of the pathology that they carry to the hospital, have it while they're there, and then they leave with it. In most cases around the world, people who haven't made it to the hospital yet, but carry around particular well-intended diagnosis of a constellation of symptoms that then they carry around as a pathology that's stuck to them forever. And it infringes upon their experience of time, and it infringes upon their experience of wonder, and it infringes upon their experience of synchronicities, and it infringes upon their experience of aliveness. And I felt that
more than any of that, it infringes upon a worldview that they have, that what happens to them is actually for them, and that it's an invitation to a transformation, as opposed to, you're a biological car, and if you have things that break down, it's just because the manufacturer, which is your genes, gave you a shit piece. And we, as the Western medical model, we have the parts and we have the fluids that we can give you, and you just have to take these fluids for the rest of your life in the form of pills. And it's just because you have a shit car, as opposed to, I think the metaphor that's more correct is, our bodies are like ecosystems. They're like nature. And if you're a good farmer, you listen to the land. And when something is the matter, it's an invitation to either add or remove something from the ecosystem, and then trust the vital life force that is creating the blossoms and the fruits, because the farmer doesn't know how to create a potato. The farmer knows how to create a condition for a potato to grow. And that, I think, like, the new psychology, the core metaphor should be nature. Because this is an interesting thing just to note, is that whatever models are used in Western culture psychology tends to correlate with whatever the most recent advanced technological invention was. And so back when Freud and Jung and Adler first came on the scene, it was steam, because the steam engine was the like big deal. And then as electricity got more prominent, and then as computers got more prominent, our metaphors evolved to meet the current state of technology that we have. And we use these metaphors to try to understand the nature of the psyche. I think the right metaphor is nature. It's ecosystems, it's plants, it's soil. And what any group of people who have learned how to interact with the ecosystem that they're in a way that doesn't destroy it, i.e., most cultures other than the industrialized West, they had relationships with nature where nature wasn't and couldn't be broken. It could just get out of balance. And then you either add or remove things that could heal it. And it's a much larger topic, but one of the big things that I'm passionate about is telling the story as honestly as possible of the events and the like cultural stories that have led us to a point where a tremendous amount of people are on multiple medications that they have to take for the rest of their lives to manage diseases. They do not cure diseases, and that most people in the Western world are at least overweight. A significant amount of them are obese. It's something like 1 in 2 US adults are on at least one prescription med. And then there's some really good books that are really hard to read. And one is called Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker, where he painstakingly, with something like 600 to 800 citations, goes through the history of how modern psychiatric meds were invented, how they were marketed to us, what their actual results were, what the scientific evidence for them were, which is very scant, to be gracious, is to say that it was scant, how the pharmaceutical companies compromised most of our psychiatric institutions, how psychiatrists got bought, and how there's very detailed list of documents and citations that he has for this, and how those psychiatrists who got compromised then went on to write the textbooks for the next generation of psychiatrists who were going to school, where it eventually turned into, it's something like half of the classes that a modern psychiatrist takes is to learn how different drugs interact with each other. It's not even to broach philosophically the idea of, is this the right way to treat psychic disorders? And then there's a whole fucking thing about the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, which is the Bible that psychiatrists have to use if they are under an insurance model. And to put it charitably, the sleight of hand that most doctors have been, quote unquote, tricked by, where they believe that the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual is based on science and is not based on consensus opinion, and that there is no biological known pathway for any disorder in the DSM, because it's actually a technical point, but if we discovered the biological pathway for any of those disorders, it would technically have to be reclassified from a disorder to a disease. If we know the biological pathway, it is now technically a disease. That means that every disorder in that book, and there's like over 500, no known biological pathway. And a really interesting entry point into the confusion that we currently have about mental disorders is if you don't know what happens when someone gets PTSD, and if they've had PTSD for 10 years, if you're a doctor and they come and see you, it will look like they have 10 different disorders. And there's really good research on this, and I can drop some books if people are curious. But once you understand PTSD, if you can help them heal the PTSD, all 10 of these symptoms that don't seem to overlap with each other, they all go away. And so with the DSM, it's a collection of expressions of different constellations of behaviors that most people interpret as a disease. And then there's a really interesting thing because it's nuanced, and I don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think people are bad. I think people are doing their best. But when you're in a system with perverse incentives, it creates shitty outcomes. But that one of the things that people who defend our disordered diagnoses is that it gives people relief. It gives people relief that there's a word for what they have, and that to somehow say that it's not real is to be violent with your words towards the people who have these disorders. And I have empathy for that viewpoint, but I'm sure that you've experienced this. Most people, their interactions with their mental health providers is, especially if it's with a psychiatrist, it's 9 or 11 minutes. And that most people don't get asked about how they feel, about how they sleep, about what they eat, about whether or not they've had traumas happen to them. They're asked, how are your meds working? And then they either are given more or they're given some new type to try. It's something like the majority of people who have treatment-resistant depression have been put on 5 to 6 different antidepressants because the belief is that the way we treat this is with pills. And so if this pill's not working for you, we'll try this one. And then we'll try this one. And I don't want to go too deep into this because I could talk about it for hours, because once I started to dig into this, I was completely blown away. Just to give some context, I've been reading like academic and scientific psychology books for 10 years plus now. And it wasn't until last year that I learned that there has never been a study that has shown that a lack of serotonin in the brain creates depression. And that shocked me. That absolutely fucking shocked me. And as soon as I found that, I read probably about 8 books, and I was like blown away that I could have been in this field and studied it this long and not know the history of that argument. And so I'll stop talking about this, but for people who are interested and really want some good research on this, Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker. He's a Boston Globe journalist. He won a bunch of awards. He wrote something before that book that was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Dude's legit. And that book is hard reading because you're going to complete that book and be pissed off.
Something here that's important that it raises a question that's a hypothetical is maybe they're looking in the wrong place. Maybe the serotonin levels that we're talking about is not originating here. It's actually in the gut, because a large percentage of serotonin is in our digestive system. And so much of our mood is regulated there. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking about some of the molecules that we'll give to people who are coming with intractable vomiting, sometimes on the withdrawal from marijuana. It's called hyperemesis cannabinoid syndrome, which is just this violent retching that people will come to the hospital with. And we give them, I think it's the THC receptors that get hypersaturated, especially with these molecules, with how potent they are. And then on the withdrawal, the serotonin that has been depleted has them go into what appears to be low mood. And then this contraction that causes them to have recurrent vomiting. And what we'll give is this medication called ondansetron, which is a serotonin antagonist. And so it upregulates serotonin theoretically again, but it's in the digestive system. We don't talk about it so much psychologically
Interesting.
unless you're talking about it in the framework of oncology, which there's certain brain tumors that have particular serotonergic receptor sensitivities that when people are having cancer in the brain that's putting a lot of pressure onto particular spots in the brain, they'll give this serotonin blocker for them to stop vomiting. But where are they vomiting from? They're not vomiting from their head. They're vomiting from down here. And so there must be some argument about the serotonin that's being blocked is not actually up here, but down here. And this is the first time I'm thinking about it since you're dialoguing. But I do find a curiosity there because I have found that travesty as well, too, where the diagnosis of this neurochemistry conversation that's happening among not the uninformed, but the human curious, that then says my serotonin is higher, my serotonin's low. This is why I feel a particular way. This is why this molecule works. I feel the empowerment that comes from them feeling like they finally have a diagnosis, but I also feel the disempowerment that they have by thinking that's the thing they have. And I'll walk into a room very often because I've never prescribed an MRI in my entire almost 5 years of practice now, and especially in the ER. I keep saying no. And the reason is maybe I'm imposing this, but I don't feel that anyone has, much like you said, they don't have the diagnosis that the DSM has put on them. They're experiencing a constellation of symptoms that puts the word as a framework for the psychiatrist to identify with and for the patient as well too. Empowerment in for navigating, disempowering for the pathologization that it puts on it, and the ultimate disempowerment. So what I'll walk into a room, I'll ask the patient in a loving way, not to pump my ego, but I'll say, am I a doctor? And they'll say, yes. I say, no, it's what I do, not who I am. And then I'll ask them, who are they? And then I'll say, does your name matter right now, or are you a patient? No, you're so much more than these roles that we're playing. And so I'm like, this is a point of identification that I have. I'm a doctor. And then I'm like, I have a badge. And then they say, and I say, so show me where your depression is. And I'll ask them, they're like, what do you mean? Where's my depression? I'll have my heart. And I say, that's the same thing. You have a phone. You don't have depression. You're experiencing it. And if there's anything I can ask of you as you leave the hospital today, it's reconsidering that the depression or the anxiety or the bipolarism or the schizophrenia that you've been labeled with as a curiosity, not that you have to let it go right now, but as a curiosity that this is a constellation of symptoms that your body, your behavior, your psyche all adapted to in response to something that you experienced at some point in your life. And it has been one of the most cathartic, liberating experiences where a human being finds that though they found refuge in that term, it's not empowerment. Refuge is not empowerment. It's a temporary space for you to find safeguard as you hopefully find the tools and resources to find a way through. And it's often a way back to yourself and connection. And we have curious modalities that have you connected to what part of you feels disconnected in the first place. And I found in the ER this ability to go there with human beings in quite a short amount of time. And I've been so curious as to why that is versus if I'm in a line at Whole Foods or some grocery store, why do I not have the same impact? And then I recognize it's because they've come into this room where their psyche has agreed that there is help coming to me. I'm playing the role of patient who needs help, and you are playing the role of doctor, and you are going to help me. Hopefully, I'm not depending fully on you for that, but that's what ends up happening. So the things that you're going to say to me, I'm more available to. Your suggestibility of the things you say have a higher likelihood of having an influence on me. And so there's such a gift in recognition of the roles that we're playing, recognizing that that's not who we are. Now, what are the tools that we're bringing forward? And the travesty of the mental health epidemic right now is the amount of human beings, even who are non-diagnosed, who carry around some form of burden on their mood and their sense of being in connection to life that ends up spilling the pain of it first on themselves, but then onto others and then to the world from not knowing. And then when they finally beautifully keep adapting and coping to not experience it, finally, when they're in their near rock bottom, go to someone that they can seek salvage and support from. They get labeled this thing, and now you carry around it forever. And then maybe there's a molecule that comes and even dissociates you more from the sense of connection. Dude, I was having a conversation with my partner earlier today, and she works in a halfway home with women who were living on the street, have serious, severe mental health experiences. And notice I'm saying not issues, experiences. It's mental health experiences that are at continuity for many because there's no support out. And she was talking to me because I was looking in the mirror as a joke, talking to myself. And she said a lot of them will speak to themselves as well, too, as if they don't recognize who they are. And then I realized that makes complete sense. To a human being who is apart has become so completely disconnected and non-permissive to have connection to life, they will look in the mirror and a part of them won't recognize the rest of them. And then if you reach for particular molecules like the methamphetamines, the strong ones that don't invite connection but provide further fragmentation, the bridges back to connection are broken even further, to the point that when they look in the mirror, a part of them doesn't even recognize who they are. And that will be diagnosed by a psychiatrist as schizophrenia, bipolarism, dissociative identity disorder, whatever it may be. And that human being has a long way back, if ever. And so the tools of recognition for this, I feel, starts with a human being first exploring themselves to recognize all the labels that maybe they hide behind or live by. And if you're in roles of providing diagnoses for individuals, like I have the permission to, according to my college, I hope to fuck that I am very mindful about what I'm putting onto that human being. And maybe the fact that I don't recognize that I'm pathologizing an experience or behavior that I'm having is the first thing that I have to come aware of. And maybe that can be so confronting, because if your entire educational route, like most psychiatrists and people have gone through medical school has been, you see it no different than the fish in the water by the time that you're swimming in it. So that for you to tell me that, no, this is not actually what you should be swimming with, is a complete confrontation with all of the 10 years of well-intended, but probably leveraged conditionality that happened in the name of supporting health, but ultimately distancing someone from true liberation. And that the psychiatrist has a very opportune experience that's on the horizon with psychedelics, because they are molecules that have you qualitatively make contact with yourself in a reframing way that you see where points of disconnection were not permitted. And what a beauty that our psyche has been wired like this. And what an opportune time that we have to actually explore this. And these well-intended arguments that we had about that justified someone who has PTSD carry 5 to 10 diagnoses before they have any opportunity to be reoriented to liberation. Absolving themselves of that diagnostic burden is something to say. Because the final thing I'll say before your reflections is, in Belgium just last week, a woman got medical assisted death after she was, you remember that bombing at the Belgium airport? Yeah, at the Belgium airport, she was one of the students that was near the bombing that happened. And she didn't die from it. Some of her friends did. And she was, I believe, 23 years old. For the next 2 or 3 years, they tried 5 to 10 different medications. She tried a host of therapies. There was no mention of psychedelics. There was no mention of internal family system, methods that I feel are really powerful for going and connecting in. And so they assisted her in dying. And they beautifully wrote how her family was surrounded by her as she passed. I was so angry and enraged when I read that, because I said not everything was explored. And this person did not have adequate support, because I do feel that even the most hurt individual has an avenue through. Not an avenue back, but an avenue through, in order to reclaim what she did not have adequate support from. And she's one of many.
Yeah. There's quite a few things here. One is because I have a sense of where I might go and what I'm about to say, and I just want to start and be very clear. We are at a place in our current mental health system where it's dangerous to be flippantly anti-medication, and I'm not. I think most of these, specifically the medications that we use to treat chronic mental disorders, is at best a useful stopgap that then transitions them into the quote unquote real work of confronting and integrating and alchemizing and transforming. And there's actually some good research that shows that most studies, when they look at antidepressants, when you actually dig into the studies, they're basically as effective as placebo.
Yeah.
The one place where they're not is for people who score tremendously high on depression, and the antidepressants will perform above placebo for about 6 months. And I don't pretend to know why that is, but I think if you look at the evidence, the thing that you can bring back from it is that the psychiatric meds that we use, at best, are good stopgaps for the most extreme cases so that you can then transition into things that work. To get into the things that work, I think one of the most important insights into mental health in the last 20 years has been the adverse childhood experience studies. And for people who don't know, a quick recap on that is some insurance company hired a doctor who was an expert at fasting to help try to figure out protocols to help people lose weight. And his protocol was he would basically have people not eat anything, and he would give them the supplements they would need at the days that they would need it. And the people he brought into his clinic, all of them were obese. He got all of them down to like healthy weight. But what he would start to experience is once they got down to healthy weight, something would happen in those people's lives where they would abandon the protocol, gain all the weight back within 1 to 2 weeks, and then would come back full of shame. And he started to interview them and ask them questions. And basically what he found, 2 stories that stand out. One was a woman who was obese. She lost all of her weight. And then she had an incident at work where a male colleague hit on her. And she had a trauma response, left work, went straight to the grocery store, bought a bunch of food, and binged for a couple of days and gained back a tremendous amount of weight. And when she came back to the doctor and the doctor asked her about it, she shared that she had been raped when she was young. Then there was a story about a man who was obese. He lost a bunch of weight and he got into a confrontational argument with a male coworker. And then he too had a trauma response, went home, gained a bunch of weight, came back, and the doctor asked him why it happened. And he talked about, I forget exactly what it was, but a family member had like physically abused him, and that the weight was almost like a protection from that. And this doctor, I wish I could remember his name, he came up with a survey of the 10 most common traumatic childhood experiences. And once this survey was created, the results of this survey are mind-boggling, because as the number of childhood traumas, as your score goes up, you don't have a logarithmic increase in chances of a bunch of things. You have an exponential increase. And there's a whole plethora of results from these studies, but one that stands out really highly is you have a 400 times higher likelihood if you've had 6 of these experiences compared to someone who's had 1 or 0 of becoming addicted to an intravenous drug or an intravenous drug. You're more likely to be depressed. You're more likely to have almost every type of mental disorder. You're more likely to be homeless. You're more likely to get divorced. You're more likely to have a criminal offense. And it's almost to the point where it's cliche now, but the root of a lot of our chronic mental and physical pain is repressed trauma. And one of the leading researchers on this is Peter Levine, a highly decorated scientist, as straight-laced as you could possibly find. He's written multiple books. He's got incredible studies on this. He's created his own therapeutic methodology called somatic experiencing. And for people who are curious, that's one of the best resources that you could go find out to understand how trauma works. And it seems to be that the healing modality of psychedelics is that they naturally facilitate releasing repressed trauma. And there's a bunch of great books on this that, again, I could offer at the end for the show notes for people who want to look into this. But one of the places to start for people listening, if they just want to get a sense of this, is to check out the documentary on Netflix called How to Change Your Mind. It's incredible. And the creator of that show, Michael Pollan, has written a book called How to Change Your Mind, where a great modern writer is able to slowly go through both the hysteria that has led us to the belief that these are taboo things to do, and then also exploring the research about how tremendously powerful they are. And that my vision, my Martin Luther-esque dream for the future is that psychiatrists become primarily shame and grief doulas instead of car mechanics. And I don't mean that disparagingly. I just don't know of a better metaphor to explain. Our current worldview is something like you're a biological machine put together by chance. The things that are wrong with you are not because our culture is fucked up, or because the way you're expected to live is fucked up, or that you're a domesticated wild animal inside of a zoo that is constantly surrounded by things that are micro poisonous in a bunch of different ways. It's not any of that. It's because your genes are a certain way, and we know what will help you. We live in a world where you can't be cured, and anyone who offers you a cure is a quack or a charlatan or a snake oils person. And we have the chemicals for you. You're going to have to pay a decent amount of money. You're going to have to be on the insurance for the rest of your life. You're going to have to take these the rest of your life. And the disconnection from your libido, the weight gain, the brain fog, the felt sense that almost everyone who is on most of these psychiatric meds has, if you interview them deeply, is that they feel, especially if they've taken it more than 6 months, because there are quite a few people who, when they first take it, they genuinely feel like it saved their life. And I don't want to take anything away from that. But for people who are on it long term, almost all the people I've ever spoken to or who I've heard speak about it, they have this nagging gnawing sense that like they're almost like grayed out, or that they're disconnected from their true aliveness. And that in the work that I do and the things that I have seen people, I've seen dozens and dozens of people who have been brought to a point of hopelessness with the current Western medical model for chronic mental or physical illnesses, go through radical transformations and arrive at the point within a year or two where they're not taking any medications. And the thing that they were told they would have for the rest of their life is...
Do you think in those moments that they're told they are going to have this the rest of their life, do you think one of the qualities that's missing is ownership, accountability, responsibility, and a potential avenue to apply tools to alleviate the depression? And that's something that they actually take ownership on, and that's part of what the big shift is?
There's a few things here that I think are interesting. I do think that's a part of it, but I think another part of it is whether or not we admit it, we are ritualistic creatures. We need ritual in order to stave off the immensity of the incomprehensibleness of everything. So we play these games and we do these games. And most people have been born into a culture where science, as it's been presented to them, because they haven't learned how to do it on their own, is like a religion. And the priests that they interact with are doctors. The cliche is the doctors even have the white robes. And that because of the respect that we have in our culture for doctors, which has really been transforming the last few years because of everything that's happened. But before that, it was pristine, that these people who are sick and they go to the temple and they meet the priests and the priests give them the dictate from God. I think we really underestimate the power of language, and that language are spells. It's where we get the word spelling from. And ancient spell books for magicians were called grimoires. And that's where we get the word grammar from. And that if you look at what companies do with their logos, those are sigils, and sigils were the symbols that magicians would make in order to conjure up energy. It's a really interesting thing to go down. But I know people who have been told by a well-meaning doctor that they have 6 months to live.
Yeah.
And it's like a spell is put on them in a way where they give up on life. I actually know someone very close to me who, one of their family members, was told that they had 6 months to live, and she watched that person, because of the words that were told to him, just give up, stop eating. And she actually had to watch his body resist death, even though his spirit had already given up for months. And it was one of the most brutal things that I've ever witnessed anyone that I have loved witness. And it's a heavy thing to speak about, but my friend who died about a month ago, when he came to consciousness in the hospital, he was told by the doctors that he would not ever walk again. And in response to that news, he made the choice that he would like to be taken off life support and would like to not live in a state where he wouldn't be able to walk again. And I might be naive, but like Joe Dispenza's story comes to mind about someone who can break their back, and that there are potential avenues of healing that don't fit the Western model that are at least possible. And the day I went to the hospital, the day before he chose to be taken off life support, I was so mad at the doctors. And I could tell that it wasn't fair, because I know that they're good people and that they are doing the best they can with what they have. But the quote that came through for me was, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." And it's interesting and it's nuanced, because the will for a person who has broken their back to potentially try for the next 5 years to struggle harder than you could possibly imagine to attempt to maybe walk with some type of brace for the rest of their life, and that's the best possible thing that could happen. It's really a selfish wish for the living. I so badly don't want you to go that I would like you to try to walk through hell for 5 years so that I can still have you around me, and that I actually respect his choice to go with grace. But I think that I think the quote, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do," can begin to touch the profundity that most people in our culture agree to play within when they go to the office, and then they get the spell from the priest. And I have seen with my own eyes, not one, not two, not five, not 10, but 20 plus experiences of people doing things that their doctors were like, "I've never seen this before. I didn't know that this was possible." And that my last thing, and then I'll pass the baton back, is that one of the most famous and highest regarded books written about the nature of science is called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, I believe it is, Kuhn. And it was written, I think, in like the 50s. And he talks about the zeitgeistal structure that it takes for a revolution in science to happen. And it's basically, it takes about an entire generation. But what happens is a model from the previous generation starts to meet up against more and more anomalies that can't be explained by the old model. And then young researchers who don't care about the old model start to try to create a new model that accounts for all the anomalies. And the new one starts to grow and grow, but it won't become the new model until the guardsmen, so the lead most influential thinkers of the old model, it won't transition until they die. That like the nature of worldviews, especially ones that work at least partially, are so sticky that a revolution doesn't happen in a worldview when it comes to like physics or things like that until an entire generation ends. And I think that we're in the midst of a paradigm shift in specifically chronic physical and mental disorders, because for acute conditions, Western medicine is the best in recorded history. It's the best. when it comes to chronic conditions, you could argue that we're the worst ever. If you look at what the current statistics are for mental health and also the rise in chronic physical illnesses.
Created a we've created a system right now that we've all pretty much subscribed to, because as we're growing up, we see our parents emulating what that society's current games we play are, with symptoms, for example, of the body, that if there's a thing you feel, there's a pill for that. And what I've asked parents to do in the ER before is not before, literally every day. It's come to the point that it's every day, where I'll ask them to go have them walk in a pharmacy and tell them for each molecule what symptom that you have that there's a pill for. And I wanted them to decondition actively, through them becoming aware first, that though there's a symptom that you have and there's a pill for that, there's an opportunity also to listen to the symptom as an expression of the body. Yeah. Is it asking you to pause? Is it asking you to slow down? Is it asking you to reflect? Is it asking you to feel? Is it asking for you to sleep? Because the opposite of listening to the nature of our symptomatologies and our expression is the silencing of it, which is no different than what we do with much of nature anyway. So then it ends up playing into where we have, in a different environment completely, the same thing happening, the silencing of the nature. And so we'll create an institutionalized experience called a hospital, and then we'll have people who are there at the forefront, the pawns there, who are well-intended, protecting this and upholding health, but not through the modalities that I feel would be of greatest honoring of what the human being's experience is. It would be one that acknowledges the symptoms, and truly, if it's an acute thing that's potentially burdening and hurting this person and could potentially end their life, let's intervene. You're bleeding out, I'm giving you blood. Let's try and stop the bleeding as well too. Rather than you're bleeding, so we're going to give you a lot of iron. We're not going to stop the bleeding, but we're going to just give you iron. We'll give you blood and transfusion, not going to close it up. So we don't address the same way. And I feel that one thing that is the opportunity here is those human beings who end up being in roles that have you so profoundly influential with the words that you use, literally abracadabraing a human being with a spell. Abracadabra is with my words I create. And so if you are in a role where a human being is coming to you and the level of weight that you carry is different than someone else, utilize this as an opportunity for an invitation for them, not for them to be told to be another way, but through acknowledgement of, I think one of the most effective ways is first voicing the acknowledgement of where the worldview currently is, and then inviting the possibility of where the human being can be through that. I think that invites them to see their feet where it's planted, and then has the GPS point a potential for them to go to that place. The same thing goes with what your friend experienced, because the healthcare provider, who's well-intended there, told them based on the symptoms you currently have, and then proceeded to say a thing that severed, decapitated hopelessness in a moment.
Yeah.
And what an invitation as an alternative could have been, hey, you stay here, put the work in. I know it's difficult. You can choose to have a human life experience that is one that is a little different. And I understand that you are feeling the grievance of all of the things that you had available to you before. Technology may catch up, or maybe it never will, at least in your lifetime, for you to maybe have that reconnection. And maybe there are other modalities that are available too. You know what? Let's call Joe Dispenza in and all of his people, and let's have a discussion here before we call it. But it must have been the same thing that I'm saying, that these people who have such a strong value that is placed on the words that they said gave him a diagnosis of his current experience, what had happened to his body, that told him that there's no way out. And we do this among lovers. We do this with parents. We do this with the priest. We do this with the rabbi. We do it with individuals in the synagogue. We do it with lovers. We do it with owners, CEOs, bosses. At every level, if there's a hierarchy of a level above, a human being has an influential capacity to say something that either invites someone through or burdens them to greater imprisonment. And the scariest place for a human being is a place where they are indifferent and hopeless. And why would we have otherwise 80% of suicides, at least in North America, happening under the influence of a molecule like alcohol. You have to be disinhibited to a place that you no longer make contact with hope, and you're severed from the screaming pains of your inner world for you to make any contact with yourself. And I feel that this type of awareness really shifts the human being to recognize the importance of their words, so really being clear on it to a greater degree, and also recognizing the responsibility you have when you are in positions of privilege to invite a human being forth into their life experience or way.
100%. And one of the things that comes to mind is it's not, and I hope it's very clear to anyone listening who is a doctor or anyone who's in the healthcare model, it's not your fault.
Yeah.
Like the current system we're in, because I'm friends with people who are doctors and people who are nurses and people who are psychiatrists and also therapists. And the model that we're in right now is, it's imagine that there's a huge landmass that's being ran by a group of companies, and the landmass is polluted. And then whenever a plant is sick, the plant is plucked out of that land and brought to the people who are trying to heal the plant. And then the plant is just put back into the polluted landscape. The food that we eat, most of the food that we eat, most of the food that's sold to us, most of the products that we have in our home, especially if they're bought off of Amazon by one of these major corporations, these stories that we're given through our media, through the things that we watch, the way our attention is fragmented, the economic pressures of the current type of capitalism that we're in, all of these have a level of toxicity to them. And then people are incredibly endurable, and they can hold so much, and then they pop off, and then they have some type of illness. They go to a doctor. The doctor is doing their best, but they have to send their patient back out into the environment that made them sick. And my dream for the future of psychiatry is that there's a network of like health professionals that are like trainers that the doctor prescribes. There's people who go into your home and they teach you how to eat. They teach you how to pick the right food. Like so much of the illness in our world would be completely reversed if we used the cutting edge understanding that we have about food at a mass scale. And it just hasn't happened yet because we haven't found the ways to create businesses and companies and a culture that would reward it. But I have hope that will be the case. The other huge, massive one is movement. Like the fucking research on an hour of exercise compared to every motherfucking pill that we have for a mental disorder, specifically depression and anxiety. If we were able to create a pill that had the effects of an hour of exercise, that would be the most profitable pill ever created in Western history. And so like for doctors, step one would be like, help these people change the way they eat and help these people change the way they work out. But what you'll learn is that as soon as you try to help them heal the way they eat or heal the way that they move, you'll find trauma. And there are very good ways, and there's a bunch of different ways. It's not like there's one way that's better than all the other ways. There's a bunch of ways to help people deburden trauma. And it's not just hand waving shit. There are things that we can do that we can measure. And psychiatrists like to give pills, and patients want pills. There's actually studies that show that people who go and see a psychiatrist, if they don't get a prescription, they feel like they got cheated. It's actually a big part of the, like, everyone agrees to play the game.
I feel that often, yeah.
But that there are pills now, like MDMA or ketamine. And as mushrooms become legal, which they will, and hopefully one day LSD, and I can only imagine a world where ayahuasca is a part of the dance, that these are things that reliably, massively will help people burden their trauma and their shame, that are the core root reasons why they eat the way they eat or why they don't work out the way that they don't work out. And one of the things that I think is much further away from entering into the zeitgeist, because I really feel like the psychedelics and the change in diet, like I think the tide is so big that it's coming, and thank God. But I think something that is further away, but that is arguably even more important, is a reification of creating art. Carl Jung was big that he was big on the idea that if he could get a neurotic to start to make art, they would heal themselves. And for people who don't know, Carl Jung went through a psychotic episode for 4 years, and he didn't release the art that he made from it until 50 years after he died. But that he chose to draw and to write the hallucinations that he was experiencing. And what's wild is everything that he is now known for. So he created the label of introvert, extrovert. He created the idea of the shadow as like a thing to work with, which is now so big in popular culture. He also was the one that brought forth the idea of synchronicity, the idea that you could alchemize these traumas to become what you wanted to become, the idea of the higher self. All of those ideas came from that 4-year psychosis that then he then used the next 40 years of his professional life to try to translate the hallucinations he had into the language of science. And he's regarded as one of the greatest psychologists that have ever lived in Western culture. And I think that a part of the psychiatrist's toolkit, like psychotherapy means the healer of the soul. And we've gotten so far away from that. But I think one of the pieces that I hope to see by the time that I die is that art becomes a prescription.
What do you think would have become of Carl Jung had he been medicated when he was starting to have his psychosis?
A really knotted part of this argument is that our flippancy in prescribing antipsychotic meds is so dramatic in our time that it's hard for researchers to find sample groups of people who have a psychotic disorder who haven't already been given some type of psychiatric drug to have as a clean control to test new shit. That's how persuasive it is. In most states, you're actually allowed to forcefully give psychotic meds or antipsychotic meds to people who are presenting against their consent. And there's some interesting stories there. But ultimately, it's an interesting question because Carl Jung, before he had his psychotic break, he was a doctor. And he was one of the leading doctors in his part of the world for people with schizophrenia. And he actually was one of the main people to cultivate the style of listen to them. And what's interesting is I actually think my personal opinion is that he listened so deeply to schizophrenics that the like mirror neurons and empathy in him learned how to think that way. And that's actually what created his psychotic experience.
Yeah.
And so I think that he would have been the type of human where you wouldn't have been able to make him take those things. But if you had forced him to, I think it would have been like, I think it would have been a wound against humanity, and we would all have been the worse for it.
There's something to be said about right now how many individuals who are in the midst of a psychotic break that, let's say, for figurative sake, that it was truly diagnosed and it was accurate. Because very often it could just be a response to grief or a response to stress that is temporary, that a human being gets this molecule that blunts them. Yes, they're no longer behaving that way, but also the reasons for it wasn't because they're so socially incompatible anymore. They weren't losing it. They were just deeply hurt temporarily. But I can only imagine now how many human beings it's possible, and it's impossible to ever know How many people are currently medicated right now that something as powerful as the Red Book or the Black Books would have been released had they not been medicated and allowed in a healthy manner to navigate through the experience of the psyche, the spirit, the soul, the heart, all in confrontation, the ego, all of it in confrontation in a way that wasn't mitigated, guilted, shamed, or judged to the degree that it is now. Because the amount of pathology that the amount of burden that a pathologized individual carries is astronomical.
Yeah.
And that's one of the arguments in favor of decriminalizing, just because it alleviates some of the level of judgment, burden, guilt, and shame that a human being carries just by taking it away from the society saying this is bad or this is not.
It's a larger point, but to get very big and spiritual about it,
Go.
one of the, like, a core wound was entered into the Western psyche when the Judeo-Christian religions got to their zenith, where all of them had this idea of there are some aspects of you as a human that are demonic. There are some aspects of you that are deserving of eternal torture. It splits the psyche against itself. Although we're not as religious as we once were, it's so deep in our roots that we're more religious than we like to admit to ourselves. And we've carried over this belief that there are parts of you that should be shamed. There are parts of you that are demonic. There are parts of you that you need to fight. There are parts of you that you need to destroy or that you need to cut out. And the tragedy of a human experience where the worldview that you're given is that you are dysfunctional by nature and that you have to work hard and do X, Y, and Z and consume X, Y, and Z that just happens to have a price attached to it from a company that has to have quarterly reports, that has to grow every fucking quarter, that you have to take these things in order to combat these innate desires and feelings and thoughts inside of you. And that the Jungian perspective, at least in the way that I interpreted it, that's like a regenerative farm, is that every part is good if it could be brought into proper accord. And that your darkness, your desire, your lust, your shame, your fear, your envy, your angry thoughts, your self-condemnation, all those things are actually messages. They're signals from parts of you that have been fragmented or shamed or exiled, that if you responded properly to the signal, you would be able to integrate that part of you, and the result would be a more total human. And just some really easy examples would be, if people were taught that jealousy and envy is actually a signal from your quote unquote higher self, whatever you want to call it, there's some part of you that knows what you genuinely desire to be. There's some part of you that genuinely knows what you want to offer to the world to feel like you have fully lived this life so that when you die, you don't have regrets. When you see someone out there doing something close to what your calling is, the intelligence inside of you offers that up as envy or jealousy. It's for you, created by you, to try to bring you more towards what your true, let's call it, path.
Yeah.
Like, one of the core metaphors that Jung talked about that I think really elucidates this is there is something inside, there is something living inside of a seed that is orchestrating the seed becoming the plant that it's meant to be. And that a part of the orchestration of that living intelligence inside of that seed is to, at some point, it's going to rupture and destroy the shell. Our egos are like the shell. And we live in a culture where we are taught, if you feel cracking, it's because something is wrong. Let us put glue on it. Whereas if we reframed all of these pains that we feel, it's that living intelligence inside of us trying to get us to fucking destroy what we are so that we can become what we're meant to be. And that we live in a culture that requires us to stay inside of our shells for the most part. And that if you don't have a community and a tremendous will and maybe grace or luck, you are going to be incentivized over and over again to stay in your shell, shut the fuck up, go do your job that you hate. Do not ever let your full aliveness out. So whenever you cry, hide your face, if you can even cry. If you ever feel any type of desire for someone, just go watch this porn. It's free. Like, one of the really massively interesting things is that most people try to justify that there's not anything wrong with porn. And I definitely have been that type of person for a while. But I heard someone articulate something that blew my mind. And it's, porn is just dealing out shame, because no one signs their name proudly towards the porn that they've watched that day. There's 99.999% of the people on this planet who watch porn would not want the first Google result to be, when someone typed their name, to be the history of all the porn that they've watched. And that's just one example of many where, again, I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it's more momentum. But the current system that we're in needs you to not break out of your shell. But also the beautiful thing is, again, because I don't think it's a conspiracy, there is an innate intelligence inside of us that instantly begins to feel resonance and admiration for people who are quote unquote weird, but who are the type of weird where it's like, that's their weird. Like the people who do their own thing. A great example is Rick Rubin. Like, I saw Rick Rubin on Joe Rogan's podcast like 2 weeks ago. This motherfucker looked like he was reveling in looking disheveled. He loved it. And it's just every time the camera would pan back onto him, his hair would be more wild, his shirt would be more like, but what was coming through him was just his fucking truth. And that this dude's entire career has just been like, I just do what feels good. And I'm really glad that it's worked out the way that it's worked out, but I don't have a plan. I'm always listening to what feels cool. And I just do what feels cool. And I think if we could reframe cool, because most people see cool as, I just want to do the thing that the people around me that I want to be accepted by think is okay. I think what he really means is like, when I do this, it makes me feel alive. I feel alive. And I think a big part of what's missing is most people have forgotten how to do the things that really make them feel alive.
Yeah. Much of the upholding of that shell is at the expense of their nature.
100%.
And the denying of nature that we have within us is one that will scream without any pause. And in different moments where it feels that nature is being infringed upon, it'll create or uphold this shell that has you preventing the audition, actually being able to hear what our nature's saying. And again, society has they've really incentivized creating distractions for you to tune that voice down, turn down the gain, whatever the voice is, maybe even cut the voice of the nature from within.
And
But
we've
interestingly,
incentivized them in that we click on it. Like, it's the reason I don't vibe with the conspiratorial worldview is that it completely shirks our half of the responsibility of the game that we're in. The companies could not do what they do if it didn't work. And it works because we enter into that game. Now, I'm not placing blame on either group because a lot of it is momentum. And there's a very good argument that can be made that as corporations grew in power and they were able to learn more about human psychology, we have gotten to a point where the main designers of the ecosystems that we live in are corporations that are purposefully trying to manipulate us, and that they know more than we know, and that they're coordinated to a level that the average human is not coordinated with any other people in their life. And we get things like the Big Mac and Coke. It is a scientifically precise balance of the most delicious things that we've evolved to want, all put into one thing, and then it becomes a hyper stimulus. And so we do live in an environment created by corporations that are full of hyper stimuluses that trigger our evolutionary drives, where it's unfair on some level, but it takes a tremendous amount of internal resources to quote unquote wake up alone. And it's one of the incredible things about one of the incredible benefits of social media is that you now don't have to do it alone. You can actually start to find people, and groups are starting to collect of, whoa, what the fuck are we doing? Like the whole thing with seed oils right now is just a great example. And there's a bunch, but it's like, I had no fucking idea how it was in everything I ate for the longest time. And it's just becoming more and more aware. One of the other things is glyphosate. Again, no idea how much that was in so much of the shit that I've done. And like, I could just rant and rant, but I remember when I was in college and I read my first book on nutrition, and I started to read studies about sugar, and just like, it changed my motherfucking life to start to recognize that this is a drug. It's addictive. It's not good for me. And the amount that our evolutionary ancestors would have in a year, I can sometimes have in a fucking meal. And once I started to cut down how I did that, I couldn't believe how good I felt. Like the level of cognitive clarity that I had when I first did a eliminative diet was like, I didn't even know that this was a motherfucking option. And I actually just went to the dentist today. This is a tangent, but growing up, I would go every time I went to the dentist, I would have new cavities. And it put a bunch of shame in me. And my shame, along with being broke for quite a few years in my early 20s, I hadn't gone to the dentist in 10 years. And I went to the dentist for the first time about a month ago, and I was so afraid. And like, I had to use my like spiritual tools to get to the point to even make my dumb ass go to the dentist. But I went back today for them to do like the first like deep exam, and I have no new cavities from having not gone in 10 years. And when I told the the dentist, he was just like, I don't know how you fucking did that. I don't recommend that. But what I know is I stopped drinking soda and I stopped eating shit that's not real.
Why did he say he doesn't recommend that?
He doesn't recommend not going to the dentist for 10 years. That's what
Oh, okay.
I don't recommend that you do that again, but it's really cool. Yeah. And I think that's a small, kind of goofy story that I think highlights a much larger issue. Most of the shit that we have been taught is not controllable is completely healable if you understand how your biology evolved to operate. And there are people out here who are screaming on their microphones because they now have platforms where people are reversing things that we've been told aren't healable by changing the way they eat, changing the things they consume, both drink, and a whole other thing is fasting. If you've got a gut issue, or if you have a chronic physical disease and you haven't checked out fasting, you've got some real hope out there for you if you want to go look into that. Now, of course, I'm not a motherfucking doctor, and go do your research and do it under medical supervision. A really interesting thing. And I'm ranting, and I appreciate how well you're holding space for my ranting. But one of the things that feels really tough for me is when I graduated, I only have a bachelor's of science in cognitive psychology. And when I graduated, I wanted to go get a PhD in clinical psychology. And I ended up deciding not to, because once I understood that if I went that route, most of my professional life would be dependent on me getting grants from either corporations or governments, I decided I'm just going to learn how to run a company. And with the profits of that company, I'll do the research I want to do. But I'm now in a situation where when I talk to people and I see that they're sick and I truly believe that I know things that can help them heal themselves, I'm legally not allowed to tell them.
Yeah. That,
I can be fined and jailed and taken to court if I give people advice on how to heal things that I have seen with my own eyes work. And that doesn't mean it works for everyone. And it's this weird game that I even participate in where I have to almost gaslight what feels like genuine helpful information by saying, I'm not a doctor. You should go consult the well-meaning person who is inside of an old model who might actually give you advice that might make you sick, but I legally can't. And it's a very interesting thing. And of course, I have compassion for people who are in the current model, have sacrificed so much to be in that model. And they're good people and they've worked fucking hard. And I know that from their perspective, people like me annoy the fuck out of them and probably trigger them because it's like these fucking influencers or coaches that, you know, are saying X, Y, and Z. They don't know what the fuck they're talking about. They're being irresponsible. They're putting people in danger. And I recognize both sides.
I didn't realize until my partner shared with me that she will see so much mental health but can't give them a formal diagnosis. I took this for granted almost, that I can do this. And I didn't realize the level of privilege that invoked. But this is a game that society says and then literally has deep punishments for. I take, coming to have known you, I can only imagine it would take a great deal of suspicion for you to even remotely consider giving someone something that approximates to a diagnosis that you feel. And I feel the level of commitment, trust, and integrity that you have behind your word. I can imagine them having to blanket generalize, not allowing anyone in there because not everyone can speak to the degree that you do. And that's one of the games. Like when you said I didn't go through the clinical route, I'm like, wow, see, he didn't go for the PhD or something like that. My psyche just said that. It was a part of me that recognized that, oh, the title is a thing, that it was one of the games that society plays. Like that MD is a game that society plays, and it gives me the admission price to do that.
Yeah.
I understand why there's that in the Instagram therapist. Recently, we just had Halloween, and the people were making these meme pictures of titles of things that are matter of fact or hilarious, and one of them was the Instagram therapist. And the things that they had mentioned regarding that were like these reductionist things that
it's straw man. That is a straw man meme that, and people are so angry. It's so interesting. Like over the course of a week, the first day or two I saw those memes, they were like good spirited and funny. And by the last day, they were just fucking straw man, attacking, venomous. And this is a much larger point, but I think the zeitgeist, like the spirit of our times, if you think of it like a landmass, the soil is polluted.
Yeah.
And the fruits of a polluted zeitgeist is war. And the way we speak contributes to the health of the soil.
Yeah.
And straw manning is pollution.
Yeah.
And we, because of Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and Reddit and all those places, it's almost like we've developed zeitgeist factories that are able to put pollutants out at such a degree that the zeitgeist has never seen before in history. And we are all contributing to it. Whenever we straw man, like most of the people who are hateful online are hateful towards people they have never met.
Yeah.
And they say hateful things. And I don't know, I have resistance to speaking it, but whenever I do, whatever group I'm in, they all nod their head and it gives me eerie goosebumps. And it's that it feels like a mass violent event is in the air, in the way you can smell a storm coming when the like electrical charge in the air starts to get high. And I feel it in our culture. I think it's a void. I think we can maneuver around it, but what sends us towards it is this flippant straw manning in the zeitgeist that is just happening at an unbelievable pace. So some of them are funny, but it was interesting to watch how like the evolution of them started out like lighthearted and genuinely funny. Like
Yeah.
good humor is funny not at anyone else's expense,
Yeah.
except for maybe the person who is being funny.
Yeah.
Like the lowest form of humor is when you insult other people. Even
Mm.
though I love people like Andrew Schultz, who's able to do it in a way where it feels artistic, but like over the course of 6 days, I just like the ones I've seen the last few days are just straight up venom.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right. And the thing is that inflates that was so inflammatory to the point that we use the word inflammatory because people understand it, but it triggered a lot of people and their response was greater attention. And then the behavioral response for people for going from soft, lighthearted was to create more, to trigger more. Nir Eyal, do you know who that is?
That's a familiar name.
He wrote a book called Hooked back in
Oh yeah.
2012, which
Yep.
was a subject of it became the playbook for a lot of the tech apps in Silicon Valley to and most
100%.
apps around the world to get people hooked. Literally, he went through I think the 292 cognitive biases, fallacies, and cognitive distortions, all of the things that we have in the psyche that and then bypass them and how to leverage them for greater engagement. And then interestingly, he writes a book in 2021 called Indistractable, which is literally a solution to the problem that he
I need to read that
incentivized.
book.
Yeah, it's actually one of the greatest little books that I've come across recently because if you feel that you have a certain amount of time in in the day and you have an increasing amount of tasks and you're calling yourself busy, what he invites in as one of the concepts to reclaim your space is something called time boxing. And in the time boxing invitation that he puts is you go on your calendar and you'll put from 10 to 11, I'm doing this. From 11 to 12, I'm doing this. From 12 to 3, I'm doing this. And then some break times. What he asks as your metric is not what did I do? How productive was I? Was my thing come out? His metric is did I do the thing that I said I was going to do with the least amount of distraction? That's it. And that is a beautiful thing to invite in because it invites greater presence. It's more commitment. It focuses your attention. But it's so interesting because it's 9 years of the playbook that he also created that ends up being this plethora of cognitive bypasses that he formulated and really encouraged and probably consulted on so much. But it comes almost to being thinking that you're creating a solution that you recognize that you actually deepened a problem.
Yeah.
I was on a plane flying from Toronto to Florida or to Miami a few months ago, no, years ago now. With COVID, I have a time
I
distortion.
totally get it. Yeah.
So, dude, I'm on the plane with this guy and I'm sitting next to him, and I have created this thing where I do on the plane where I'll either gift The Way to Love and by Anthony DeMello, or I'll give a journal to someone. And it'll
That's
be
so
through
cool.
yeah, it's a simple form of acknowledgement for a human being, either to see themselves through the writings or to converse with themselves through the writings of their own. And I spoke with this guy who was sitting next to me, who he had a backpack, a sweater. And when we were getting off the plane, he didn't have anything up there. And I asked him, I said, dude, like we got into conversing, and I find out from him real quickly that he was a multi-millionaire seller on Amazon. He was 28 years old and he started selling very bizarre items, but he scaled up so fast that he ended up selling his company for close to 35 million, and he owns only 35 items now. And the entire 35 items that he have was on his person at the time. No suitcase,
Whoa.
just a backpack and a thing. And it took him going through the process of creating what he felt was a solution to feel the burden of the weight that he had, where he saw the gluttony of humans, where we are consumptive and filling ourselves and financially like really burdening a lot. He saw a lot of people get burned so much, and he decided rather than being any solution, he figured by first being the pause, no longer being a part of it, and then acting upon it himself, this kind of like the indistractability thing. And I found such a beautiful humility to it. And I gave him both the Way to Love and the journal at the end because I'm like, dude, I'm sorry if this is adding like literally 2 more items to your 35 only, but I feel that these could be of like an addition to that. And he gracefully received it.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, man. I think a lot of us can serve by like that saying by Talib, which is by subtraction, where we add more to our lives, the substance of it, by removing some of the things, by subtracting things that are in the way. And if we had, for example, more human centric capitalism that had the remuneration of money being as a testament to the acknowledgement of the human, I think
Yeah.
we'll have a really big shift. And spaces like the ones that you and I walk among, which I'm grateful for, have the opportunity through dialogue first to be the example of what capitalism through another way could completely be. Not capitalism at the expense of the human, but as a complement to them. And that can happen in various forms, but minimizing the amount of distractions can be one of the ways. And becoming curious about what are the things that are burdening a human to such a degree that they have to reach for certain things and be mean to others. I say mean, but it feels like such a small word compared to all of the things that are available in our lexicon. Yeah, man, I don't know, I feel like we come full circle on this, but that
I
it's an
feel the same
opportunity.
way, man. I feel like that last point highlighted by that story is exactly the medicine I need in my life. I'm going to get that book and I'm going to read it
Yeah.
because it's honestly, I think this is the point to end on because we're at 2 hours and I got to go get on my walk. But that
Yeah.
one of the things that I've been feeling recently is I came from a family with a very low amount of money. And when I graduated college, like I was able to go to college because my mom went to war and she gave me her GI Bill. And that was a huge blessing. And then after I graduated, for probably about six years, I was broke. Like I existed on maybe 1,000 a month. And some of my favorite memories was just grinding and I had almost nothing. And it was just hunger for my life. And I had very few friends. I had almost no material possessions. And now I'm radically more financially abundant, relationally abundant, opportunity abundant. And I feel this like malaise over my life because of how comfortable I am. And I actually feel paralyzed by all the things that I know I could do. Like I have so many opportunities in front of me that it feels almost like I'm without doing anything, also being a glutton in this weird, and that I know that my medicine is to add by subtracting. And the thing that I want to end on, and I think that this is for everyone as a frame that I'm playing with, is what if I really considered that there is a collective unconscious? And I've read Jung for 10 years and I still just interact with it like it's a theoretical idea. But what if I actually took on the frame that there's a collective unconscious and that I'm a part of it? And what if the energy in me that drives me to compulsively consume is the same energy that drives the lumberjacks in the Amazon that cut down the trees? What if the same drive in me that seeks immediate gratification through porn also is the same energy in the collective that exploits women? What if the same energy in me that judges and is envious of men who have more status or power than me is the same energy in the collective that's currently attacking masculinity? What if I alchemize my franticness and it actually helps the collective franticness? What if when I choose to be compassionate to someone who triggers me, it actually relieves that energy a little bit in the collective? What if my responsibility is that large, is that big? And if not me, then who? And if not now, when?
That's the curiosity that he invites through inquiry. And I truly invite everyone to, before the next podcast or the next thing that you plan to do, pause for a few minutes, scroll back, and reflect on those questions in relation to your life. With all the avenues that you have available of things that you can do, experiences that you can have, what gets you closer to your nature and the experience of nature in others that you'd like to potentially support in as well. Erick, thank you for taking the time, brother.
This was awesome, man. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I look forward to connecting with you in human form again. And at this moment, this man is recently engaged and sitting in that as well, I believe.
You are correct, and it's glorious.
Yeah. Please have a beautiful walk. And everyone else, that's an invitation for yourself and me to move as well. Thank you, brother. Any final words?
I love you.
I love you as well. I want to thank Erick Godsey for joining me on the podcast. You can find him at erickgodsey.com, ErickGodsey.com, and across all of the social spheres. He has a journal program that you can engage with, and he has a podcast, The Myths That Make Us, that's available just about anywhere that you find podcasts. Consider leaving a review and rating the podcast. I'm not going to tell you what to rate. You do as you feel. And please, before this podcast ends and you go on to the next thing, take 3 to 5 minutes in silence to allow some of the information that you heard to be contemplated, digested, and integrated. To the degree that every experience has a moment to actually have it be processed, it has a greater chance for it to be instilled into your life. I wish the rest of your day and week is beautiful. Take care, remain curious, and don't forget to play.